Amid the rush of everyday life, things move so quickly that we rarely stop to truly observe what's happening around us. But in this story, that very sense of normalcy becomes the starting point of a murder case, raising a chilling question: how many things unfolded right in front of us, without anyone truly recognizing them? In an old industrial area located on the outskirts of Baltimore in the mid-1990s, where abandoned warehouses, material storage yards, and deserted roads created a space almost separated from urban life, a man lived in a worn-out trailer placed right within the premises of his workplace. During the day, he appeared like any other ordinary laborer, working, moving around, and leaving no particular impression on those around him. When night fell, he set up a small roadside food stand, serving simple dishes to people passing through the area. Everything followed a familiar rhythm, repetitive and without any unusual signs. No one asked questions, no one paid close attention for long, because in such an environment, silence and lack of connection were normal. However, years later, when this man was arrested and brought into the interrogation room, he himself was the one who shattered that seemingly simple picture with a series of shocking statements. He not only confessed to criminal acts, but also described them in a way that forced investigators to reconsider everything they had previously believed they understood. Yet, the deeper they went into his statements, a major issue began to emerge. Not everything he said could be verified by evidence. Some details showed notable matches, while many others went far beyond what the investigation could confirm. It was precisely this overlap between what could be verified and what could not that turned the case from merely a search for a criminal into a complex problem of distinguishing between truth, distortion, and the possibility of manipulation of perception by a suspect during interrogation. That man was Joe Matheny, a man who appeared in investigation records in Baltimore in the mid-1990s, in the context of several missing person cases. Initially, these incidents were recorded as separate missing cases, with no clear signs to connect them into a pattern of crime, no direct evidence, and no significant pressure from the media, as most of the victims belonged to groups that received little attention in society. This caused the investigation process to be slow and scattered. However, as the data began to be examined more carefully, a specific area and several recurring connections gradually emerged, forcing the police to reassess the entire situation in a more serious direction, and from there, a suspect was identified. To understand why this case was able to exist for such a long time without being detected from the beginning, it is necessary to look at the circumstances of the victims themselves. Kathy Magaziner and Kimberly Spicer were not just names in investigation records, but women living in unstable conditions, having to manage day by day with an uncertain life. They moved frequently, had no clear routines, and sustained their lives through short-term relationships. This made tracking their movements difficult and caused their absence not to be immediately noticed. Both of them worked in street-based service jobs, an environment that required them to interact with many strangers during hours when few people were around, in areas that were not closely monitored, where encounters happened quickly and were rarely questioned. It was precisely this nature that made the activities around them indistinct, leaving few clear traces and increasing the level of risk in each interaction. When investigators reanalyzed all the data, they realized that the incidents were not isolated coincidences, but showed signs of a deliberate selection pattern, focusing on individuals with little protection from their living environment and who were less likely to be immediately noticed when they disappeared. At the same time, the initial response to the victim's absence was not strong enough to trigger early warnings, because in their context, losing contact for a period of time was not uncommon. It was precisely this time gap that became the key factor, allowing the events to occur without detection until the scattered details were gradually connected and the overall picture began to emerge. Information collected during the investigation, along with statements from acquaintances, showed that the victims' last known appearances all revolved around the southwest area of Baltimore, where many old industrial facilities, material storage yards, and low-traffic roads are located, especially quiet at night. This was also an area frequently visited by people working in street-based services, as it was less controlled and allowed discreet access to clients. As the investigation expanded, investigators identified an important connection. Both victims had been present at the property where Joe Matheny lived and worked, specifically an area belonging to a pallet company, where he stayed in a trailer within the premises. This was a space separated from residential areas, making activities there difficult to detect. When cross-referencing statements, geographic locations, and timelines, the fact that both victims were last seen around the same area was no longer an isolated coincidence, but became a critical intersection in the case file. From there, it helped police begin linking the incidents and shaping an investigative direction focused on a specific suspect. Was Joe Matheny the central link behind the entire case, or merely a name that happened to appear within a series of suspicious coincidences? That question quickly became the main direction of the investigation, and to find the answer, investigators no longer focused solely on the crime scene or clues, but began to look deeper into the man himself, because sometimes a suspect's past is the key to unlocking the entire story. Joe Matheny was not the type of person who immediately aroused suspicion at first glance, but he was not entirely invisible in society either. With a large build, standing about 1.85 meters tall and weighing nearly 200 kilograms, he was often given the nickname Tiny as a form of ironic mockery. Matheny was born into an unstable family in Maryland. His father was a heavy alcoholic and died when he was still young, while his mother was involved with drugs and was largely absent from her children's lives. His childhood was marked by being placed in orphanages, lacking stability and control from an early age. As he grew older, Matheny joined the military, but this period did not lead to any positive change. On the contrary, it was also during this time that he began using drugs such as heroin and cocaine. After leaving the military, he cut off contact with his family and gradually fell into a transient lifestyle, frequently visiting bars and living with homeless individuals in makeshift camps in southern Baltimore. All the money he earned from manual labor jobs was spent on alcohol and drugs, causing his life to spiral further out of control. However, in the early 1990s, Matheny went through a period that seemed stable when he had a job, started a family, and had a child, even having a place of his own. But that stability did not last long, as his wife also fell into addiction and eventually left him, taking their child and all their belongings. This event was described by Matheny himself as a major turning point that caused him to lose control completely, and from that point on, his life began to spiral in a more dangerous direction. After his marriage collapsed, Joe Matheny believed that his wife had left with another man and fallen into drug addiction. According to what he had heard, she often went to an area beneath an abandoned bridge in southern Baltimore, where homeless individuals and drug-related activities were concentrated. In a state of anger and loss of control, Matheny decided to go to that location, though it was unclear whether his intention was to find his wife or to confront what had happened. In a state of anger and under the influence of substances, Joe Matheny remained in the area beneath the bridge and came into contact with two homeless men, Randy and Randall Brewer. According to his later statements, after using drugs together, the situation quickly escalated and led to an attack that resulted in both of their deaths. These were considered the first incidents in the series of serious acts he committed during this period, marking a clear shift from a person losing control to an individual beginning to carry out repeated acts of violence. After that, Matheny approached a woman who was believed to be acquainted with his ex-wife with the intention of obtaining information. He attempted to lower the victim's guard by providing substances. However, when he did not get what he wanted, the situation quickly escalated out of control and led to an attack, resulting in the victim's death. Shortly afterward, another woman was lured in under similar circumstances, showing that his behavior at this point was no longer a single impulsive act, but had begun to form a repeated pattern in which the victims were selected based on their vulnerability and environments with minimal supervision. During this time, while Matheny was still near the area where the incidents occurred, a man who accidentally appeared near the scene became an unintended witness. Fearing discovery, he proceeded to attack this person to eliminate the risk. This action showed a clear escalation in behavior, as anyone who appeared outside of his expectations could become a target. From that point on, the series of events was no longer connected to the initial purpose of searching for his wife, but instead turned into a sequence of continuous acts of violence occurring within a short period of time. According to Matheny's own statements during later interrogations, All of these incidents occurred within a single night, a detail that drew investigators' attention to the severity and rapid escalation of his actions. Not only that, what he later revealed also showed that the way he perceived his victims had completely changed. He no longer saw them as individuals with their own identities, but merely as targets within his sequence of actions. It was precisely this dehumanization that became a key factor in explaining why his behavior was able to continue without any sign of stopping. About 2 weeks after these incidents, Matheny was arrested in connection with the deaths of 2 homeless men. However, due to the lack of direct physical evidence, the case did not have sufficient grounds for prosecution, and after approximately 18 months in custody, he was released. This decision was later viewed as creating a dangerous turning point, because from that moment on, Matheny no longer returned to his original objective, but instead moved into a new phase where his actions were not only repeated, but also became more systematic and increasingly concerning. And from this point on, the story took a different turn, as Matheny not only continued committing crimes, but according to his own statements, also began to seek profit from those actions, a detail that made the entire case far more controversial and disturbing than what investigators had initially imagined. After being released due to insufficient evidence for prosecution, Joe Matheny returned to his normal life as if nothing had ever happened. However, in reality, this was the point when everything began to enter a more dangerous phase. He no longer continued searching for his ex-wife as before, but gradually shifted toward repeated behaviors, no longer tied to a specific personal objective, instead becoming a way for him to seek a sense of control and personal gratification. During this period, Matheny returned to work at the pallet company where he had previously been employed and convinced the business owner to allow him to live in a trailer located on the premises. It was a secluded location with little foot traffic and almost no supervision at night. This environment created ideal conditions for him to operate without drawing attention, and from this point on, his behavior began to form a clearer pattern. He approached women in vulnerable situations, built initial trust using substances, and then brought them back to his living area. Matheny began setting up a small roadside food stand near where he lived, where he served simple items such as hamburgers. This appeared to be a normal activity, not attracting attention, and fitting with the surrounding working environment. However, what made the story concerning was that he himself claimed that part of the ingredients used were related to the victims he had harmed, and he believed that mixing them with other ingredients made it difficult for others to notice any difference. However, there is no forensic evidence confirming this. This is only his own statement, and this detail is what has made the case controversial to this day. Notably, in his statements, Matheny did not show hesitation or remorse when speaking about this. On the contrary, he described it as a way to make money while also controlling the situation in his own way. This is a point that psychological experts have paid particular attention to, as it shows that the level of dehumanization of the victims had gone far beyond typical behavior, where the boundary between action and consequence almost no longer existed in his perception. After maintaining his activities for a period without drawing attention, Joe Matheny continued repeating his behavior until, according to his later statements, he reached a situation of running out of supply and began searching for new targets. In early December 1996, he approached a 23-year-old woman named Kimberly Spicer, using a familiar method, luring her with substances and creating an initial sense of safety, then bringing her back to the pallet company area where he lived. From that point on, the victim was not seen again. Kimberly's disappearance became a critical link, as it occurred at the very location that had appeared multiple times in previous reports. Just a few days later, a decisive event occurred when Matheny invited a woman named Rita Camper, using a similar approach. However, this time the situation did not unfold as before. When Rita refused and recognized signs of danger, Matheny began to show clear, threatening behavior. But in that moment of losing control, he made a mistake, creating an opportunity for Rita to escape the area. She ran through the material yard, climbed over a fence, and got out, becoming the only surviving witness who could recount what had happened inside his property. After Rita escaped, Matheny fell into a state of panic and made a critical mistake. He called an acquaintance and asked for help handling a serious situation related to a victim at the premises where he lived. However, this person recognized the seriousness of the request and quickly reported it to the authorities. It was this call that triggered a response from the police. Shortly afterward, authorities moved in on the pallet company area where Matheny was living, proceeded to arrest him, and began collecting related evidence at the scene. From that point on, the case officially shifted from suspicion to a criminal investigation, and Joe Matheny, who had previously been living at the center of these events, was brought into the interrogation room. At this point, a factor that made the entire case distinct began to emerge. Instead of denying or avoiding the situation, Matheny appeared cooperative and proactively provided information. It was the way he recounted the entire sequence of events with a calm demeanor that led investigators to realize they were dealing with a suspect with an unusual psychological state, something that would directly influence the entire interrogation process that followed. When Joe Matheny was brought into the interrogation room, investigators quickly realized that they were not dealing with a typical suspect. There was no obvious tension, no avoidance of eye contact, and no attempt to construct a story to protect himself. Instead, he maintained an unusually calm demeanor, answered questions directly, and showed almost no hesitation. This forced interrogation strategies to be adjusted from the very beginning. At the beginning, investigators focused on checking the consistency of his statements, asking questions related to time, location, and his connections with the victims. Notably, Matheny did not deny his presence in the related areas and even proactively added information. However, this cooperation itself became an issue because he did not only speak about what the police already knew, but also expanded the narrative into many other details that had never been verified. During the interrogation, Matheny displayed a psychological pattern that investigators considered particularly noteworthy. He showed no clear emotional response when referring to the victims, no signs of remorse or concern about legal consequences, and described the events in a way that was almost detached from personal emotion. This made the analysis of his statements more complex, as the usual indicators used to assess credibility were largely absent. Another important point was the way he spoke about his actions, not in a linear sequence, but often interweaving different events, sometimes adding details that went beyond what the police could verify. This forced investigators to clearly separate verifiable information from elements that lacked supporting evidence, while also using cross-referencing techniques to assess the accuracy of each part of his statements. Despite this, his cooperative attitude and lack of denial helped the investigation progress more quickly. Investigators were able to use relevant information to cross-reference with physical evidence and witness statements, thereby strengthening the case file. However, at the same time, they were faced with a major question: what is the truth that can be proven, and what are the details that exist only within the suspect's own account? And it was in this interrogation room that the Joe Matheny case no longer remained solely about determining what had happened, but also opened up a more complex dimension where the boundary between confession and reality became not entirely clear, making the entire story more unpredictable than at any previous stage. As the interrogation continued, Joe Matheny began to go far beyond what investigators had asked. He not only admitted to incidents that were already supported by evidence, but also claimed to have committed many other acts in greater numbers. In these statements, he described a repeated pattern of approaching victims, targeting women in vulnerable situations, gaining their trust through substances, and then bringing them back to his private area. These accounts partially aligned with what the police had already recorded, but as he continued to expand his narrative, the scale and number began to exceed what could be verified. According to his statements, the initial motive stemmed from searching for his ex-wife after being abandoned, a state of anger and loss of control that led to the first acts. However, when investigators questioned further, Matheny himself admitted that after that phase, the reason was no longer tied to a personal objective, but shifted toward a sense of control and the gratification he gained from harming others. This is an important detail, as it shows a transition from a specific motive to repeated behavior that was no longer dependent on the original circumstances. However, not everything he stated could be verified. Some details regarding the number of victims and specific situations were not supported by physical evidence, had no matching missing person records, and lacked witness confirmation. This forced investigators to be extremely cautious. They only used the parts of his statements that aligned with the evidence to build the case, while the remaining parts were considered unverified. The defense attorneys also focused on this point to question the reliability of the confession, arguing that long-term substance use could have affected Matheny's memory and perception, causing him to exaggerate or misremember events. This further blurred the line between truth and narrative, making it even more difficult to determine. Even so, one aspect remained consistent throughout the entire interrogation: Matheny's attitude. He did not attempt to justify or minimize his actions. Instead, he even admitted that what he did was not entirely driven by a specific reason. When investigators asked about the motives behind his actions, they did not receive a complex explanation or a typical attempt at justification. Instead, Matheny responded in a brief and cold manner. He acknowledged that initially, everything may have stemmed from anger related to his wife leaving him, but afterward, that reason no longer mattered. When asked directly why, he simply answered that he did it because he wanted to a response indicating that his actions were no longer tied to circumstances, but originated from his own distorted perception. Matheny also stated that the only thing he felt dissatisfied about was not what had happened, but that he had not achieved his original objective related to his ex-wife and the man with her. This statement led investigators to realize that the focus of his thinking was not on the consequences for the victims, but remained centered on his own personal emotions. This further reinforced the assessment that he lacked empathy and did not view his actions in the way society typically does. That attitude continued to be evident during the trial phase, when Matheny did not attempt to lessen his responsibility, but instead requested the highest possible sentence for himself. He stated that apologizing would have no meaning because it would not be genuine, and he accepted the consequences in his own way. In 1996, Joe Matheny was officially arrested and brought to trial. During the proceedings, the prosecution did not use the entirety of his confession, but instead focused only on the cases supported by clear evidence. This was a necessary strategy to ensure the legality and effectiveness of the trial. The charges were built based on physical evidence, verifiable statements, and concrete links between the suspect and the victims, while allegations lacking sufficient evidence were excluded, even if they were attention-grabbing. This clearly reflects a fundamental principle of the legal system, where shock value cannot replace evidence. During the legal proceedings, Joe Matheny was not tried in just a single case, but in multiple separate cases divided according to specific charges. Among them, the most important were two main groups of cases: the one involving Kimberly Spicer and the one involving a victim named Catherine, often referred to in records as Catherine Magaziner. In the first case, involving Kimberly Spicer, the 23-year-old woman who went missing in December 1996, this was one of the cases with the clearest evidence. The data regarding time, location, and witness testimony, especially from Rita Camper, all directly pointed to the area where Matheny lived. This case played a crucial role in securing his conviction and served as the primary foundation for the most severe sentence later on. At the same time, Matheny was also tried in another case involving Catherine, a victim identified through prior statements and evidence. In this case, he was charged with murder and robbery, and it was also the case in which the prosecution initially sought the death penalty to ensure that he would not be able to return to society. In addition, there was the case involving Rita Camper, the woman who survived. In this case, Matheny was sentenced to 50 years in prison on charges related to kidnapping and assault. Rita's testimony not only helped establish his actions, but also played a crucial role in connecting the cases together, turning suspicions into evidence that could be used in court. Initially, the court sentenced Matheny to death in one of the murder cases, and notably, he did not oppose this sentence. In fact, he accepted it as an inevitable consequence. However, in 2000, after a legal review process, the death sentence was overturned and replaced with life imprisonment without parole, becoming the final ruling. It is important to understand that this sentence does not reflect everything Matheny had confessed, but only the cases with sufficient evidence to be proven in court. Many other details in his confession, although attention-grabbing, were not included in the verdict because they could not be verified. This created a significant gap between the story told by the perpetrator and the truth recognized by the law. Matheny later served his sentence in a prison in the state of Maryland until 2017, when he died at the age of 62, officially closing the case from a legal standpoint. However, The controversies surrounding what truly happened still remain, as not all questions have clear answers. The Joe Matheny case is a real case that occurred in Baltimore, Maryland, USA, not only a story about a criminal, but also a clear reminder of the gaps within society, where when victims go unnoticed, when disappearances do not trigger alerts, and when forgotten areas exist in silence, crimes can occur undetected for a long period of time. At the same time, this case also shows that not every confession reflects the full truth, and sometimes the greatest challenge of an investigation is not just identifying the perpetrator, but determining what actually happened. The content in this video has been edited by the channel's team based on investigation records to provide a clearer perspective on motives, psychology, and warning signs that were overlooked. Don't forget to continue following real cases and how they are analyzed from an investigative perspective by subscribing to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos.